Porky Pig's Haunted Holiday. This is one of, I think, like half a dozen Super Nintendo Looney Tunes games that mostly just followed the exact same formula of being a subpar platformer, with the Looney Tunes license being what tried to carry it. I know some were significantly worse. That Tasmanian Devil Running in the Desert game gets a lot of flack, and I think I've heard that the Bugs Bunny game was kinda okay. But this one didn't really surprise me in terms of its quality. Again, it's, let's be upfront about this, a pretty subpar platformer with some issues. But it does do some really quite strange things. The plot to this game is that Porky Pig is reading brochures in bed to find the next great destination for his vacation. And then he falls asleep. I'm sorry, were you expecting more plot? Because that's kind of all you're getting. There's not really anything after that. It's just, he's fallen asleep reading some brochures. You're probably wondering in the title, where does the Haunted Holiday come from? And that's a very good question, one I honestly don't think I'm prepared to answer, and I've played through this game. Because there's not really all that much of a creepy spookiness to this. Like, the first level I think takes place in a graveyard, but when I played it, it had a bunch of Christmas lights up, so I wasn't really getting the terribly haunted vibe about it, and then the rest of it's just some places you go. You can go to a desert, you can go to Atlantis, which is kind of neat, you can go to the Alps, which is a particularly interesting stage, and it's just a bunch of sort of generic platformy levels that don't really have a consistent flow or theme. For a game that's labeled a haunted holiday, I would think that there'd be a lot more spookiness. But there's no spookiness, it's just the platformer with some levels. I mean, you can fight a ghost as the boss of the first area, and later on you can fight Tweety doing that sort of Jekyll and Hyde transformation that I do remember from the actual Looney Tunes cartoons, even though I haven't seen them in about 20 years. And that fight is an absolute joke, but other than that, there's not really anything that's terribly scary, unless you're really, really terrified of Yosemite, who took way too many growth hormones and is about 50 feet tall now. But like, it's still just not terribly horror. If you're looking for a plot to this game, it's basically an excuse that doesn't really make sense with the rest of the tone of the game, or at least the tone it's trying to establish with its title, and it's really just, we made some platforming levels in some platforming environments, go platforming. And indeed, a platforming we will go. This is a pretty standard type of platformer. You run around, you can jump. That's kind of your entire repertoire of abilities, is just moving and jumping. Weirdly enough, in Stage 2, for a very brief period of time, you can get a projectile attack that is only available with a pickup, but it's only available in that stage, and at no other point in the game does it add extra mechanics that would be dedicated to that ability. Like, maybe that button would just be an action button that has like a different effect on every stage. It's not like that. It's just, for some reason, level 2 has a projectile attack. It's never really explained why, but it does. The rest of the time, it's more about just jumping over spikes, jumping on enemies, and trying desperately not to die instantly, and occasionally interacting with bits of environment that will move you to the next area, such as giant springs, where Daffy, or later on a big angry skull, will laugh at you and then make you jump. Hey, we found some horror. This will not continue. Either way, the platforming itself is okay. There are a few issues in this game, however. I noticed, especially in level 2, the sort of cowboy town area, there was lots of bits of the environment that looked like they were like platforms to jump on, and you just couldn't. There were bits of the background that looked like functional platforms, and there were chunks of the environment that looked like you could get to them. I mean, there were items and monsters and stuff up there, so I assume you can, but without using those bits of background that weren't interactable, I'm not sure how you would, unless you, like, backtrack a super far away to take an alternate route, I guess. But the benefits to that, I'm not sure are even really existent. The other big issue I found with the platforming was that there was a lot of really awkward enemy placement. I saw this especially in the Atlantis area, where there's a lot of like tight corridors with spikes and stuff, but you'd frequently run into fish that would just swim back and forth, you know, like fish do in games. But oftentimes there would be very little room to actually maneuver, so it was oftentimes just a situation where I have to like duck under stuff and just wait for stuff to pass, maybe move a step, wait, move a step, wait, try and jump now, oh, I almost got murdered by spikes, but no, I'm okay. Situations like that were not particularly fun or enjoyable and just slowed the game down to a crawl. And it wasn't great because the Atlantis level especially had a very maze-like design to it frequently you'd be like trying to work your way towards an end goal only to find like 2 ways you could go, and you take one and then you'd find out that you're like back at the start for some reason, because they just decided there has to be 2 routes, and it's not terribly clear which way you need to go at some of these points. It's not a frequent occurrence that you'd run into like this weird situation where you don't know where to go, but that was one of them. Another was a later teleporting maze thing, but those are teleporting mazes. Those are always nightmarish. Weirdly enough, in terms of alternate routes, I actually ran into one point where I kind of like skipped half this stage because they kind of expect you to go this one way, and you could just jump high enough to kind of get around the entire maze. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but you can kind of take a huge shortcut in the Atlantis level near the sunken ship, which was kind of interesting as well. And that's basically the platforming. It's not horrible or anything, it's barely serviceable. There are some neat interactions. Climbing on vines to swing across stuff is a lot of fun, although it wasn't necessarily clear if those were going to hurt me the first time I ran into them or if I needed to use them. Running into frequently falling platforms was both frustrating, but at least it kept the pace of the game going, because seriously, you can't tell which ones are going to collapse or not, but at the very least, it kept you on your toes. Although the threat of instant death from falling was not so fun, but otherwise it is entirely functional. The series of stages, like I said, it's pretty standard for the most part. The first one, for some reason, actually follows the theme of being haunted and was a graveyard. Although when I played it again, there was Christmas lights, and that's because, for whatever reason, this game actually has multiple variances of every single stage. It's not a particularly big thing, but like, if you die, it'll swap variants. So one day you might be at like the daytime stage, it'll be nighttime, might be Christmas. It's interesting that they have like different weather patterns and stuff. There's like sometimes rain, I think. I don't know if this affects every single level because I didn't game over terribly frequently in this game, but the variants just keeps it visually interesting. Which, you know, that's cool. And I guess it does lend it at least a little bit of replayability, because there really isn't a ton here that would make me say you gotta play this game multiple times, but seeing every stage a couple times is rather interesting. Otherwise, you've got an underwater stage with no swimming, so it's just a stage with a blue filter over it, really. But, you know, the Atlantis theme is kinda cool. The Alps stage is the one stage I think is actually worth noting, because it's weird? Like, it starts out completely normal in like a snowy mountaintop area. Okay, that's kind of what I was expecting, sure. But then I guess Porky decided to take a whole bunch of drugs or something, because the next second he's in The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali in this like really bizarre surrealist landscape where nothing really makes sense. And honestly, this is the exact thing that would make me say you gotta play this game, because this was at least interesting and different. Not like, you know, Cowboy Town and Graveyard Town and Underwater level, and I think there's a mine level, I can't quite remember. There weren't many levels, there's like, I think 6 or 8. You know, I played this game just yesterday and I can't remember. But the surrealist Salvador Dali painting area in the Alps, that was interesting. And then weirdly, once you're done with that nonsensical teleporting maze, then you just end up back on a mountaintop and you fight the Yeti for reasons that I don't quite understand, because it has nothing to do with what the rest of the level was, but at the very least, that rest of the level was pretty neat. Otherwise though, like I said at the top, this is pretty similar to a lot of those Looney Tunes games. It's just sort of a subpar platformer with the Looney Tunes license. It's not bad, but it's not really doing anything particularly special, outside of that one exact specific instance, and maybe the level variation to keep things interesting, but otherwise it's not a platformer that I think does anything particularly well. There's also a lot of situations where you can just drop onto spikes and die instantly. There's a lot of instant death pits all over the place, but I mean, it was a platformer for the time. That's pretty par for the course. It's just all the platforming surrounding that isn't particularly exceptional or makes it terribly noteworthy either, you know? The overall presentation to Porky Pig's Haunted Holiday is certainly one of the higher points. I've always thought that Looney Tunes games always looked great. They've always looked exactly like the, you know, series they're based off of, and that's actually why I want to play a lot of them. I'd really like to get that, what is it, Sheep Raider on PS1. That game's always interested me. But I always thought that Looney Tunes games always looked great and always captured the feel of the cartoons. And this one is no different, with one very bizarre exception, and that is Porky Pig's idle animation. Porky Pig's a pretty jolly guy from what I remember. Again, it's been a while since I've watched Looney Tunes that weren't the Looney Tunes show, which I still think is the best chunk of it. which of course makes me a weirdo. But for some reason, Porky Pig, for his idle animation, for being such a cheery guy, he just looks really bloody angry for some reason. Like, who offended you, Porky Pig? Did I personally offend you because I threw you into too many pits? Like, what is that? And then he starts, like, shivering like he's scared or something, and then he goes back to looking angry. And it feels like he can't decide whether to be angry or terrified of what is, for the most part, a pretty mundane environment with very uninspired enemies. I don't know, there's just something about that idle animation that is just bizarrely out of place and feels desperately not Porky Pig. But that's the world we seem to be in. This world of a haunted holiday that's not particularly haunted nor very much of a holiday, but it's weird. It's very weird. The enemies look fine, the bosses look great, they're huge too, which I really do appreciate the really giant bosses. Even though fighting Yosemite was rather tricky, he's got some awkward mechanics that make you have to like jump immediately after being attacked or you miss damaging them, but I did like the bosses, even though some of them were really easy, some of them were just dumb, and the environments are, you know, they're what you expect, and then they're really bizarre, and then they're back to being what you expect. For whatever reason, there's just a bizarre single moment of just strangeness that makes everything in this game click. And then the rest of the game is pretty much just a standard platformer. Audio-wise, the music is inoffensive and largely unmemorable, although I will say that there are some voice clips in it. When you game over, you do get a "That's all folks from Porky Pig," which is presumably what everyone came here to see, and probably where most of the game's budget went. Also, when Daffy shows up to scare you to make you jump 50 feet so you can actually get to the next platform, there's actually a soundbite for that, although I'm pretty sure that's a stock one and not something bespokely recorded or anything. And then they reuse it later for, I think it was a moose that shows up and does the same thing later on. For some reason, Daffy only does it in the first stage. Overall, the presentation is fine. It looks great. It sounds okay. It could use some more memorable music, but otherwise, it's completely inoffensive. Now, if you want a copy of Porky Pig's Haunted Holiday on the Super Nintendo, cheapest copy I see on eBay right now is $30, and that's about double what I paid. I found my copy at a local wargaming shop because for some reason that's the only place in this town where you can buy retro games anymore, but I would not pay more than maybe $25 for it, and even that seems exorbitant. I think $15 would be fine. It is at its core a pretty subpar platformer. Like, there's nothing offensive about it. There's nothing that's terribly wrong about it, even when it was having those sort of awkward corridors with fish swimming back and forth where it was hard to make any progress, and even having to backtrack in those areas. You know, it was still fun. It's just, there's nothing that makes me say, you gotta play this. This is a must-have for the system. The only thing about this that's even really noteworthy is Porky Pig's really angry sprite for some reason, the weird Salvador Dali painting world, and the fact that there's different weather variants for different stages. Like, those are three very noteworthy things about that game, but none of those things actually make this something that stands out as a game that needs to be played or anything. If you like Looney Tunes, I can recommend it on the basis that, you know, it's more of that and it's not going to offend you in any real meaningful way, but there's nothing here that makes me say, you gotta own this. This is perfect for a Super Nintendo library. It is effectively a filler game with one or two kind of interesting, noteworthy bits that make it kind of strange, but there's nothing that really says this is an amazing game. I mean, I would argue it's not even a haunted game, and haunted's in the title. I think at its core, this game tries to portray itself as being very strange, and only at like maybe 2 points in the game does it ever commit to that. It kind of betrays its whole title of being a haunted holiday. It's Porky Pig's basic platformer-rama. And yeah, I mean, it does have that whole being a basic platformer thing down, but this is on a system that had so many platformers, you know, it was an absolute fight to be bought instead of something else and enjoyed more than something else. And I'm not even sure I can say you should play this over the Duck Dodgers game or the Bugs Bunny game. Definitely play this over the Tasmanian Devil game and maybe the Roadrunner game, because I've heard that one's a bit rough. But is there a reason to own this over any other platformer on the Super Nintendo? Not really. It's not bad. It's just not particularly noteworthy, and like I said at the top, at its core, Porky Pig's haunted platformer-rama was neither haunted nor particularly noteworthy. It is a subpar platformer, and unless you really want to fill out your Super Nintendo collection, you could get it very cheap, or you're a Super Looney Tunes fan, there's not really much of a reason to get this game. It's fine, it's inoffensive, but it's not a particularly standout game, and I think it was really banking on its license to carry it. and I don't think it succeeded. Those aren't filigree. Can I go down the well? Oh, snap, yeah, I can. Oh, and you die if you hit the bottom. Okay, that's kind of a jerk move.